suffrage is the right to vote. Women's suffrage was about more than just the right to vote. It was also allowed women to serve on juries and run for elected office. It gave them power to make change in the world that they had never had before. The first state to allow women to vote was the Wyoming Territory in 1869. Women there actually had the right to vote before it became a state in 1890. The other earliest states were Utah in 1870, Washington in 1883, Montana in 1887, Colorado in 1893, and Idaho in 1896. What do you think, Brooke? Do you think it's interesting to learn about women's suffrage? I think it's pretty cool. Women in Oregon gained the right to vote in 1912. Western states and territories were the first to allow women the right to vote for a few reasons. First, because they were newer governments and tended to have residents interested in new ideas and ways of thinking. Also, including women residents in their lists of registered voters would increase their population count. States with larger populations have more representatives in the U.S. Congress, and therefore more say in the laws that get passed. In order for all women in the U.S. to gain the right to vote, the national laws had to be changed by an amendment in the Constitution. This is something that the Congress in Washington, D.C. has to vote on, and at least 37 states have to agree to it. Women tried to raise awareness and educate both men and women about the importance of voting rights. To do this, women organized themselves into groups that would publish papers and went out into the streets to talk directly to the people. They tried to use their influence to persuade men in positions of power and encourage others to do the same. They also learned to get more attention for the cause by having their story and pictures in the newspaper. Do you think that's a good way to get more attention? I think it is. Some women in 1913 walked all the way from New York to D.C. in the winter to spread the word and participate in a march there. Sometimes the success of a protest came in the form of bad news. In 1913, a peaceful march was interrupted by unfair treatment by male onlookers. They threw things at them, including live mice. This helped spread the word of the movement by astonishing the public. In any movement, there is room for people to participate in different ways. Some make speeches, some write poems, and still others donate money or bring sandwiches to keep the protesters fed. Some people like to work quietly from inside the government, while others go out for loud, radical demands for change. These two sides can seem contradictory, but they actually help each other. The passionate and radical groups can come up with new ideas and energize people to make positive change in the world. Sometimes their actions are shocking to the public and may make smaller changes seem more reasonable in comparison. Small changes over time can really add up. The fight to win the right to vote took a long time. The women's suffrage movement in the U.S. started in 1840. In 1878, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution was proposed but was rejected. An amendment that gave the women the right to vote finally passed in 1920, 42 years later. Actually, all women were not allowed to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 got rid of any discriminatory rules in many states that prevented women of color from voting. So that makes 125 years from the start until full voting rights for U.S. women. Oregon women were able to put the question of suffrage on the ballot many times between 1884 and 1912. During that time, both women and men gave speeches, wrote articles, and did whatever they could to encourage more people to join the cause. It took 6 tries before the majority of men in Oregon voted that women should be allowed to vote. There were many setbacks along the way. Some states gave women the right to vote, but then took it away again later. Sometimes one political party would agree to give women the right to vote because they thought women would vote to support them. When the women voted differently than expected, they changed the laws again to take the vote away. Women of color played a large role in women's suffrage, but frequently did not benefit from it as much as white women did. In Wyoming, the first territory that gave women the right to vote, There were education requirements that prevented formerly enslaved and non-English speaking women from voting, even when all the white women of Wyoming were able to vote and run for office. After the U.S. Constitution was changed so that many women had the right to vote, women of color in many southern states still could not vote. Many southern states had rules to make it hard for African Americans, men and women, to register and vote. These rules included having to pay a fee to register to vote or take a reading test where you had to read and interpret the Constitution. Many states had grandfather laws that were like a free pass for white people who might be too poor to pay the fee or unable to pass the reading test. Another amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1965 that got rid of any of these discriminatory states' rules. In many states, there are still fights going on to prevent discriminatory and racist rules from preventing people of color from voting. There were many locally important and nationally famous women of color who fought for the right to vote. Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Mary was born in 1823, almost 200 years ago. She was a teacher, writer, and in later life earned a law degree, only the second ever awarded to an African American woman. She was a member of the National Women's Suffrage Association and spoke at the NWSA's 1878 convention. She also advocated for the 14th and 15th Amendments at a House Judiciary Committee hearing. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was active in conferences and meetings dealing with slavery, gender, and racial discrimination. She was a lecturer, author, and poet that popularized the art of protest poetry. Mary Church Terrell. Mary was a college-educated woman from Tennessee focused on suffrage and one of the founders and first presidents of the National Association of Colored Women. Terrell fought for women's suffrage and civil rights because she realized that she belonged to the only group in the country that had two such huge obstacles, both sex and race. Ida B. Wells Burnett. She was born into slavery during the Civil War. She became an influential journalist and writer arguing for the rights of African American men and women. She was unafraid to point out when white women in the suffrage movement behaved in racist ways. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, suffragist and lawyer from North Dakota, Chippewa tribe, appointed by President Theodore Roosevelt to become a clerk in the Office of Indian Affairs, she helped fight for the voting rights of Indigenous Native American women. Women of color who were important suffragists in Western states. Elizabeth Piper Ensley. She was from Colorado and worked on the successful effort that gave women the right to vote in 1893. Naomi Bowman Talbert Anderson. Naomi was a poet and writer born in Indiana and active in California, giving speeches and writing articles supporting votes for all women. Maria de G.E. Lopez. Maria was a Latina leader who gave speeches in Spanish to teach women about suffrage in California. She was active in her local Votes for Women club and became president of the College Equal Suffrage League in 1911. Dr. S.K. Chan. Dr. Chan was a doctor and a first-generation Chinese immigrant living in Portland, Oregon, who advocated for suffrage for all American-born children. I think it is absolutely crazy that it took over a century, 125 years, for all women of color to actually be able to vote and be able to run for office. What's something in your community that you want to fight to change and improve?